Hello, everybody, and welcome to another State of Web Performance. We have a wonderful panel here today to be talking about all the latest advancement in making sure that our web experiences are as fast as they could be and as enjoyable as they could be for all of our users all over the world. But before we get into that, first I want to introduce today's sponsors, and that is This.Labs. A bit about who we are at This.Labs provides architectural guidance, staff augmentation, on-demand subject matter experts, temporary CTOs, one-on-one pairing, mentorship, and open source strategy support. If you're interested in seeing some of the work we've done with our amazing clients, make sure to take a look at our portfolio page at this.co/portfolio. We're also hiring, so if you're a software engineer or a DevOps engineer, send us your info at jobs@this.co. Framework.dev is a place to search for top web technologies, compare key features, and discover community-curated resources to help you learn. So make sure to check out framework.dev and give us your feedback on what's missing and what we should add. As far as some of our upcoming events, both in the State of series and our mentoring events, we have our React mentoring coming up on September 6th. There you can speak to React experts and ask questions in a small welcoming group of community members. You can ask specific use case questions or even just network and chat about tech career advice. What's interesting about the React mentoring, the Vue mentoring, and the Women in Tech monthly mentoring is these events are not recorded and they are not broadcast live. So you actually have to sign up to attend them. This is to make sure that people have a wonderful time in a safe place where they can sort of have frank conversations without worrying what people will say in posterity. So if you're interested in those mentoring sessions, whether that be React mentoring, Vue mentoring, or interested in hearing about the Women in Tech monthly mentoring, make sure to sign up. Then finally, the state of Deno. We're going to be discussing the growth of the Deno ecosystem, updates, roadmaps, and upcoming initiatives with maintainers. That's going to happen on September 27th. So if you've been interested in finding out more about what's going on with Deno, you'll definitely want to check out that state of event as well. Now I'm going to bring all of us back into view here and let us introduce ourselves. First of all, the host for today's panel. My name is Rob Ocel. I'm a team lead and software architect at This.Labs. Certainly not nearly as much of a web performance expert as the rest of our panel today, but I am very eager to be a part of the conversation and to learn from them today. As for my co-host, I'll let him introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. My name's Henri, best known on socials as Henri Helvetica. I'm with the Venerable Web Page Test by Catchpoint. I am the dev community lead, and I'm equally as excited to have this great conversation about web performance today with our esteemed panel. I got to say, I'm looking at this slide, and I just want to remind everyone that CSS is awesome and centering is hard. So I'll just leave it at that.
Oh, I can't unsee it now, Henri. Thank you.
All good, man. We might as well get things up and running. And at this point, we have a incredible panel joining us today, and I'll let them slowly introduce themselves. Let's start with Katie.
Hi, I'm Katie. I work on web performance at Google. Previously, I was a DevRel for Core Web Vitals, and now I work on Aurora.
Amazing. Welcome, Katie. And Sia, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sia Karamalagos, the Green Greek on Twitter, because Karamalagos is hard to spell. But I work on web performance at Shopify, specifically with merchants, although we're also trying to influence things internally to make broader changes as well.
Awesome. Welcome, Sia. And, I realized there was another Sia Karamalagos on Twitter, which is why you use the Green Geek. Is that it? Is that the real story?
No, I didn't know another Sia Karamalagos existed.
Okay. I just made that up.
Maybe it's someone trying to beat me.
It's all good. And I'm delighted to have Alex. Well, we are delighted to have Alex Russell with us. Alex, please.
Hi, good morning. I'm Alex Russell. I'm a product manager on Microsoft Edge. I've been working on browsers for a long time.
Amazing. I don't think a performance conversation can be had without a browser involved. So I'm looking forward to your input. And we also have Annie Sullivan with us. Annie, by all means.
Hi, I'm Annie Sullivan. I'm an engineer on Chrome Web Platform, and I lead the team that develops the Core Web Vitals metrics.
Ooh, Annie helped develop Core Web Vitals metrics. We know what's going to happen today. And last but not least of the quick quintet, we have Mel with us. Please, Mel, by all means.
Hey y'all, I'm Mel. I'm an engineer on the web performance team at Etsy.
Awesome. And you could find Mel on Twitter at Mel Maleficent. Is that what it says?
Maleficent, yeah.
I love it. I was just like looking at it. It's like, oh, that's amazing. Welcome, everyone. We are delighted to have each and every one of you here, and we're going to have an amazing conversation about web performance, something that I know we all love and enjoy. We're in the business, but something that's also certainly grown in, I'd say, some complexity, the involvement of metrics and all that has sort of the myriad of metrics at the very least. So how should we start this, Rob?
Well, I think it might be worthwhile to go around and just sort of get a temperature check. I notice we get a lot of monthly reports on how things are progressing with web performance. We've certainly seen a lot of advancements with different frameworks, meta frameworks and libraries and approaches, and new web page test versions come out in recent months, certainly since the last time we've done state of web performance. So maybe just going around and get everyone's impression of kind of what's been catching your eye. What have you been, noticing? Where do you see the trends going right now as far as web performance and the industry in total?
Okay, I'm going to say it. Annie, you start.
All right, well, I'm personally really, really excited about performance after load. My team is working on the new interaction and XPaint metric, and they've also been working on really being able to detect single page app transitions so that we can do a better job of measuring and understanding how much they do help performance, because I think there's a lot of open questions there. And I've been just super, super excited to see, the framework ecosystem and the larger ecosystem just really focusing on performance and having that be a measurable thing, as opposed to kind of making assumptions about what's better and not. So I'm really, really excited about what's going to happen in the next couple of years in the ecosystem.
That's amazing. And, INP is certainly something that we'll probably expand on since it is, even though it is sort of, an experiment as sort of officially listed, but people have been discussing it and bringing it up in reports and whatnot. But you did mention the frameworks, and that, basically prompted me to then move to Katie, because Katie is currently working closely with frameworks. So if you just kind of want to expand and let people know what exactly you are doing in that space.
So there's what I'm personally working on, and then I think what's going on in the framework space, and I think there's a lot more going on in the framework space than I can speak to. But currently, one of the things I've been working with is some of you may be familiar. There's a image directive for Next.js. The idea being is it's a convenient API to make it easy to use an image CDN and make sure you're sizing your images correctly. And so adding a similar feature to Angular. So that I think Angular announces their new release next week, and so it'll be part of experimental for that. So we're excited about that.
And you mentioned we're excited, and I don't know if people know, and I don't know how much you can discuss, but did you want to potentially expand on what you and the good people at Google are doing with the Aurora team?
Yes. So Aurora, the idea there is kind of trying to, instead of having sites maybe on their own individually make performance optimizations, what if we built the optimizations into the frameworks themselves? And so the work that Aurora has been doing has been around that. Historically, Aurora has worked a lot with Next.js, but has also been trying to work with other frameworks as well. So we've been working with Nuxt and also Angular to just get more performance features shipped into those platforms.
And, something that's super interesting, and it sort of hit me a little later. I mean, what's that movie again when, is it Usual Suspects? Where at the end, he's looking at the wall, then all these things start to kind of connect in his head. He's like, wait, I think I just got played. I remember looking back at Chrome Dev Summit. I think it might have been 2018, and Guillermo was on stage. And I was like, what's Guillermo doing here? Guillermo from Next.js, by the way. And was this essentially the beginning of like the Aurora project in so many ways, in how like he was talking about Next and Chrome was involved in that conversation?
I probably at that time would have been more focused on other performance stuff, but I'm guessing like that kind of fits. It grew out of that timeline, and so that would make sense. Like historically, you've seen Aurora ship a lot of features for Next.js. So yes.
Awesome. Speaking of Chrome Dev Summit, I mean, Mr. Russell, coming from the browser's perspective, what has been happening on your side of town?
So I no longer work on Chrome. I work on Edge now.
I realize that's why I said just browser. So.
Yeah. So it's been interesting over the last year. I've shifted my focus away from mobile a little bit towards desktop, which makes sense given Microsoft's interests. And it has been, I think, a little bit dispiriting to watch the same things that I was concerned about. So insistently on mobile playing out in desktop too. Annie maybe had the positive case for how we're, potentially going to be able to remediate at scale the kinds of effects that we're seeing currently in applications. But you asked, where is the industry at, and how are things progressing? And while I do think the trend line is currently maybe slightly positive, which is good, the status quo is really, really bad. It's a trash fire. Performance across the board is regressing as new sites get redeveloped. So if you had an old site, it was probably okay. And if you rebuild it on today's stacks, it's probably not going to be okay by default. So we're in a spot today where even for desktop class CPUs, networks, and memory, the current set of tools that the industry thinks are, and architectures specifically, it's less about the tools and more about the architectures. The tools and architectures that people now assume by default will work generally don't. So we got a long way to go. So this is a target-rich environment, so lots to do. And I'm very excited about Interaction Next Paint because it's going to, I think, help shine a very bright light into the places that are very obscure today.
So you just said you're excited about INP, but it sounds like you would also be keeping a very close eye on what Katie's team at the Aurora project would be kind of, trying to do at the very least.
So I spend a lot of time consulting with teams like Katie does, and honestly, I observe a lot of teams digging out, right? They get themselves into a position. I've got this extremely long blog post on the topic about performance management maturity, but basically, if you get yourself into a loop where you dig out and then you regress and you dig out and then you regress, eventually management, flips the bit on your team or your ability to deliver. This is a really bad spot for teams to be in. I work with folks who have had launches delayed by, most of a quarter for bad performance, or I've worked with teams in the past that have had, they will lose more money in a month than I'll ever make in my life due to adopting these tools and architectures. And that is really dispiriting to see over and over and over again. So, I don't want to say that the framework community has necessarily attempted to mislead people, but the net effect has been to mislead. And now that we're so late in the game, with so much evidence piling up in the negative column, that the lack of disclaimers and alarms on top of a lot of these tools, and in fact claims that I think aren't justified by the results, suggests to me that a lot of this is willful, and that's a bad spot rhetorically. It's a bad place for the discourse to be. It's a bad place for the industry to be.
Okay. We're certainly going to have an opportunity to expand on that a little bit more. The one thing I wanted to mention before I move on to our next guest is that, first of all, shout out to all the people I see, Paul, Katie, Rick, Mr. Viscomi. You can actually ask questions in the chat. A few of us are keeping an eye on it, as I am as well. So if you do have some questions, by all means. You had mentioned consulting, and which is what is the reason why I'm going to move on to Sia. Sia, I know that you recently joined a team, but I'll let you sort of kind of mention that in your introduction and maybe talk about things that you're working on right now.
Sure. I mean, I do want to get back to the original question too, but it does kind of go together. So before I started Shopify, I was also a consultant. I was doing both web dev and web performance. Then I started Shopify because I wanted to have a bigger impact. So more coming back to that, like, anything we can do at the browser and framework level can really like have a larger impact across the entire web than when we do individual efforts. But then the team I work on is specifically supposed to help out with Shopify Plus merchants. But we want to make sure that we're still providing resources because, we have different levels of services, but providing resources to all levels of Shopify devs, but also trying to make sure, and this gets a little bit back to what Alex was saying, is that we need to make sure that we're steering people in the right direction from the beginning, right? So like Shopify by itself is not bad on performance. By default, you're using like Liquid and, server-side rendering. So it's all just HTML rendering. But we get into this problem when people start adding more things or doing it incorrectly. But even in Liquid, there's things you can do better. Like, for example, very much related to the work, Katie, you've done with image on Next.js. And so, for example, in our docs, if it doesn't say that by default our image tag does auto format, then developers will maybe try to manually put in formats and manually doing source sets when by default it's actually better to put less. So it's like we need to make sure that we're affecting those communication points all along the chain so that they don't get into these bad situations. But we're also there to fix the bad situations.
I mean, it sounds like you have your hands full.
Yes. I mean, you got to do something.
But that's certainly something I do want to sort of look into or talk about a little later. The fact that, that team was specifically put together, and I'd also, well, I'm sure everyone would love to hear about, some of the plans that you have moving forward. And, Shopify being a bit of an e-com gorilla, a bit of a giant. Let's go into some more e-com, Mel. I know you're at Etsy, so I'd love to hear what things you're working on right now.
Yeah, so gosh, I have so many thoughts. But yeah, I'm kind of working on something a little bit similar to Sia, where I'm working on getting in touch with product teams at Etsy and making sure that they have the performance chops to improve performance in their own domains, because the performance team at Etsy is relatively new. We're about 2 years old at this point. And so the first year of our team, we were kind of like, okay, how do we improve performance at Etsy? And we were going into different pieces of the product and making small changes to improve performance. And we did do that, but we realized that it wasn't sustainable for the however many handful of performance engineers that were on the team to be managing performance across the whole product. So right now I'm working on a program to kind of help product teams audit their own domains in terms of performance and one, stop the bleeding in prod, and then two, hopefully work that new performance knowledge into the dev lifecycle so that they can stop further regressions and then add observability so that they don't slowly regress. So yeah, a little bit of everything at this point.
I mean, you've said regress a few times, so I think I get the point, which is why I'm going to ask you. You talk about stopping the bleeding. Like, what kind of quote unquote bleeding have you seen that has really alarmed the team?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's honestly just a lot of engineers don't really know what web performance actually means. And I'm actually finding this is across the industry and across levels of experience. So I think it's something, and even with web performance experts, it's hard to define, right? Like what is web performance? And so a lot of people, it's like something that we all agree is good and something that is important, but what does it actually mean? Like, yeah, no nested for loops. You have to watch your IO, but what is beyond that? And so it's more about like educating people. When, you know, there's a couple of examples, but it's more about just baseline education of, okay, what are the code changes that I need to make given these current challenges, and like making that and helping people make that connection. I had a product engineer tell me, I pulled up a web page test result with them, and like and this is not unique to web page test in any way, but they saw the waterfall chart, which is a feature that is in Chrome DevTools, web page test. Many tools use a waterfall chart. And they were like, listen, I got to tell you, when I see a waterfall chart, I just want to like close the page and run away. Like it's so overwhelming to me. And so that really helped me understand where people are at when they're starting to think about performance, and when they start running into big performance issues that they're seeing for the first time, and how to make it more accessible to them.
Great point. So you are exposing literacy issues, essentially. And, you know, speaking of waterfall charts and obviously browsers, Mr. Russell, you know, when you hear comments such as Mel's about developers not even being able to sort of understand a waterfall chart, what sort of runs through your mind?
Well, all of this is cultural, right? At some level, so many of these parts of education come from, you know, not something you get at university or in a course. They'll all come from who you sit next to and what they were taught and what values they held. And, you know, it sounds like Mel is trying to upgrade the level of sort of across the organization management maturity, which only really sticks if the culture improves, right? So that makes perfect sense to me, that there would be a culture that's at one level, and that those folks would find themselves, with those norms and those priors. And in different organizations, I would expect, like, you know, Annie's old team over in Search, right? Like, I would expect a very different level of understanding. And I'd love to hear like how you encounter those cultural differences, Annie.
Yeah, I think this is like a really difficult thing for me, right? Because I used to work on like the front end of Google search, right? Where they're like experimenting every change, and like literally every shift, that at least at the time when I worked on it, we could go back and detect like this 5 millisecond change came from this feature and these 10 milliseconds came from that. And now, you know, I'm seeing a broader world and it's really different. And what I would really love to figure out how to get across is, you know, exactly what I'm working on is, there's a million best practices out there, right? Like, you look at all the lists of House audits, and that's just a tiny bit. You can add rules and you know, more things to do. But what you really want is not to be thinking about things in terms of best practices, but thinking about things in terms of bottlenecks. Like, what is making your specific site slow? What in the architecture of your site do you have to think about, and the design? When it goes into things like framework choices, like you need to be thinking about the requirements that are going into those choices and how like that's going to affect your performance. And I'm not sure how to like change the industry into thinking about things in those terms. Like, let's measure and then optimize. Let's try to figure out what the biggest problem is and go after that. Let's try to design for the things that we know are going to affect our site. But I really wish that I could figure out how to shift things.
Nice.
Interesting. I just wanted to keep riffing on this piece because we got a question from chat. The question as written was, how much should performance initiatives rely on platforms and frameworks versus education of engineers on best practices and performance analysis? But I wanted to kind of go off of the education piece because, you know, my wife is a lawyer. She has to do continuing re-education credits every year to keep on top of the latest updates in law. We don't have that in development. And, you know, I sometimes remark to people that you can have a long senior career only writing JavaScript and no HTML, CSS, and vice versa. But yet we just still have the only separation of engineers be front end engineers and back end engineers, right? Do we need to start building more vibrant teams so that this kind of collaboration can happen on teams? Do we need to create an industry-wide culture of continuing education? Because I feel like we're having this conversation on the state of web performance, but I've been a part of the same conversation on the state of accessibility and the state of security. And the list goes on. There's a lot of things to know. Do we need to start finding teams that have people that are experts in each of these things, or how can we solve this education issue?
Please, Sia, by all means.
So this is a slightly indirect way of answering that question, or like it's at least the way I'm thinking through. But so before Google Search adopted the Core Web Vitals as influencing search and ad ranking, honestly, like web performance consulting was kind of a hard sell. Like it was the rare company that would reach out and be like, oh yeah, let's do this web performance stuff. And, I know some people dislike it, but when you start measuring things and have it influence other parts of the business, then you start getting more motivation to fix some of those things. There is some gaming involved too, but for the most part, I think overall it's been an improvement. And so you have to think about those incentives. And I mean, you can always misalign incentives too, but having those incentives does make an impact. And if you don't have it, I think most people who are developers, or at most companies, because most of us as web developers, we're just trying to push features out the door, right? We want to get this feature out, and there's no time to really go back or think about or train to make yourself better, unless it's a specific like ticket that you're working on requires you to learn, I don't know, how to do, logins. So I think it's really hard to make a large impact unless you have something that's inserting itself in that kind of motivation pipeline.
Yeah, and I think it's like you don't know what you don't know. And it's like one of the good things about Core Web Vitals is it at least said like, here are some numbers, and we're also going to give you the measurements. Because like realistically, if you wanted to go ship your run solution, like you would have to understand this thing. You would have to like probably make a case to your company about the value of it and everything. So you can just be like, I'm like curious, like what are our numbers? And that can at least say like, like there's some room for improvement. And then hopefully like someone will start looking. And then obviously like there's a huge amount of information to sift through to try to figure out how to improve it, but at least it points you in the direction as to like, maybe this is something to think about. And I think it would be actually to say like on Chrome side, we're trying to figure out like, how can we be a little bit more prescriptive and like pointing people in the right direction towards the optimizations that will help. I forget who brought it up earlier, but like some things are best practices, but like whether they'll move the needle for your site, like isn't always the case. It might be great to adopt image lazy loading, but depending on like what the constraints are for your site, like you might not see a change in the numbers. And so trying to like point people to, and I think one thing case we're thinking about this in particular is LCP. Because I think more so than the other two Core Vitals metrics, like so many things can influence LCP. Where it's like, where do you even begin with optimizing? Especially like once you start looking about anything like a little bit more complex than like, oh, just compress the LCP image. So like trying to point people in the direction of like, is it a slow server response time? Is the browser delayed in discovering the image? All those kinds of things. And I forgot how we got into this question. So
that's the best part. The interesting part, I think, is one of the interesting parts is the following, because getting back to everyone's favorite topics, frameworks, and it seems as though they have been going around for the most part, saying how they're taking a lot of the heavy lifting out of your hands. They're going to handle this for you naturally. You don't even have to look. Just drop in, whatever it is that you need to drop in. And, we'll say, image components, it's going to do this and this and this for you automatically. But in the same breath, we've just discussed that we have noticed that there's some literacy issues. So on one hand, the framework is saying like, oh, you don't have to learn that. We'll take care of it for you. But on the other hand, we're listening to Mel tell us that someone refuses to look at a waterfall chart, you know. And I'm going to come back to Alex on this. And Alex, you'd mentioned earlier, you felt that there may be some kind of fool's gold being sort of, you know, pushed around.
Yeah. So think of it this way, right? Like, I think we can all postulate a framework or a system that makes optimal trade-offs based on the traffic mix, the type of clients that you have, the available bandwidth, you know, but all the sorts of session depth, right? Like the kinds of interactions you're going to try to take on inside the application, whether or not there's a login, right? All these things would influence the kinds of trade-offs that you'd be making as you sit down to construct a new site or to redevelop an existing one. And we can imagine that I think we all have it in our heads, that idea of the slider that you could just toggle to be like, well, I'm making, you know, a portfolio site, or I'm making a blog, and the other end it's like, well, I'm making Figma, you know. And those are they have extremely different interaction patterns and session depth and all kinds of other trade-offs. And so what teams are struggling with, in my experience, is that they have been handed piles of complexity. Often they pull them in, and so they're very attached to them. And whether or not those piles of complexity are appropriate to that location on the slider is extremely difficult to suss out, right? Like Annie was pointing at this earlier with the question of post-load interaction and navigations, where you're sort of taking a big semantic change in the state of the application, which might change the URL. You know, when we started working on this new navigation API, one of the hopes was that it would maybe help, you know, enable more transparency about what was happening in these big semantic changes in application state in order to wire pieces of that back up and make it visible. But people could derive that kind of RUM data right now. They could go understand their total session lengths. And so one of the things that I see unresolved in this question is, how much complexity did you buy off that wasn't necessarily going to be paying you back, because you own all of it? I think this is the ground truth for me, is that, like, you own everything in that stack. If it came with a transpiler, you own its configuration. If it came with default settings for any of these components that make maybe this image component, you now suddenly own all of that code. And if you don't believe that you own it, you're in denial, and that denial will hurt potentially you or your future team. So the early acceleration has not been pushed back on with sufficient force in terms of, like, understanding the cost of complexity over time, because it is a break. The complexity adds a break factor. It adds drag.
And I think, like, that type of complexity, it's hard to, like, fix with, like, a convenient, like, web API, like, you know, add this one attribute and, like, it will get faster. Like, that's the kind of thing that, like, there needs to be a design doc and, like, probably a meeting, and, like, you really need to, like, understand the underlying application. And so this kind of reminded me of, I think Sergey had a question in the chat about, like, how much of this is stuff that, like, platforms and browsers can influence and frameworks versus, like, I think kind of like one-off expertise. And I think that's where there's always that need for that one-off expertise, because, like, that's something that, like, Chrome can't help you with. Like, at some point at the end of the day, like, someone on your team has to understand, like, how the application fits together and, you know, how to untangle it to make it better.
Yeah, and this is really where I wish we were, like, working from first principles when we're talking, teaching web developers just everything, right? Like, start with JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. How does the screen reader read your page? How does the search engine read your page? Like, how do they understand it? What are the points of complexity about your design? And then think about, like, why are you using a transpiler? Why are you using a framework? Like, what do they build on top of your specific use case? I wish we taught people how to do that more.
To unpack the other part of Sergey's question, though, is, you know, one of the things I've been excited about historically were things like Google's AMPs, like their AMP image component. I think Next has a good image component that takes care of so much stuff for you underneath the hood of lazy loading and source sets and doing all sorts of things that a lot of people wouldn't even realize you could do or should do. But I see this as potentially a double-edged sword. And this is sort of in Sergey's question, and what y'all have been saying is that another thing I've been seeing, and I say this with complete compassion, but watching the React community learn and interact with platforms like Remix, And the amount of threads of developers who are learning how form works for the first time after 5, 6, 7 years of development. And this is no judgment. There's a lot of things to learn. We're all learning new things all the time. But, by having solutions in the platform, that helps lower the smallest bar. But it seems like at some point we do have to come up with a transition plan to get people to learn how it's working under the hood and migrate away from the assistive tools once they've sort of gained that knowledge. Is that right? Because otherwise it just seems like we'll become too dependent on the helpers that we try to create for people without understanding why we're using them.
Alex, absolutely. I just saw your thumbs up.
Oh, I'll plus one the idea that we are going to be responsible for what the helpers do, and we have to learn the stack below us. At the same time, computers do things for you. That's why they're good. If they didn't do things for you, they wouldn't be very good. So I think we should calibrate our expectations here. But at the same time, this all leaves me with a real allergy to the current discourse around web development stacks, where I just want to see fewer people drowning in complexity that is not paying them back. Where if they had started simpler and were asking questions along the lines of, okay, now I've got this really complex thing, how do I refactor it into something that's going to be better for these long sessions or for these users with these really intricate needs where it's not just post, and wait. That's a much more interesting conversation. We have new tools. That's a place where we could actually add a bunch of new web APIs that would help. Like we've spent the last decade developing them. They're great. But if you start at the end point of all the complexity, excavating those simpler patterns it's nigh impossible. It's extremely challenging for teams, and it's extremely painful because they get backed into it when things aren't working, rather than starting on a progression towards that. Sorry, Mel, you were talking about how the trade-offs get operationalized. I'd love to hear more about that.
Oh yeah, I was just saying that I was thinking that like we recently added a responsive image component to our design system at Etsy, and balancing all of these things it's an art form, and I think that's really what the root of web performance these days is balancing what can we automate for people and what do people still need to know to have the benefits of that automation actually stick. And so I feel like there's no right answer, and it's very situational. I think that's what a lot of us are pointing out now, but like we kind of settled on require the engineers to understand the pieces, the elements that are involved in responsive images, but do the manual work for them. So like you have to still tell the image component, okay, we want the image to render at this size at this breakpoint, but the image component will generate out the HTML attributes that you need to tell the browser that. So we settled on that happy medium. We'll see. Ask me in 6 months how it goes. But it's actually, I'm really excited that it's added to our design system, because before our responsive image logic was kind of scattered and differing and not always actually working. So it was exciting to see.
I kind of want to say really quick is that it's funny. We keep using, I feel like our discussion has been an example of an education thing. Like we keep using this image thing as an example. And I don't know if it's because we started with it or if it's because it's just easier to talk about. Like it's one of those easy things, but it's also one of those things that, maybe doesn't move the needle that much, except for, when you accidentally lazy load your LCD. But it's another one of those things that it was an interesting observation to me that we keep using that example, but it's interesting.
Do you see images ever really showing up in traces as like a big problem, Sia?
I mean, except for lazy loading the LCP. Like that's the number one issue. And also it's a big problem where I'm at right now, and I'm trying to like make it better.
And JavaScript is generally the problem.
I know that Rick Viscomi, pardon me?
I like working on images, but it's like, it's that thing I like to do, but it doesn't actually make an effect.
I mean, I was going to say Rick Viscomi is in the chat, so he could probably whip up a quick query before the end of the show and find out how many images were, being showing up in the LCP or trying to.
Oh, I know that. I did that query for the Web Almanac, so I can tell you it actually increased from last year. Oh, I should let Mel talk about it because she's writing the chapter. But yeah,
Okay.
I was just like, oh my God, we're getting worse. Sorry.
Okay, so sorry about the spoiler.
I know.
But I want to answer something in the chat. Oh, there it was. So, something that, we've apparently agreed on, that, there is, a bit of a lack of understanding from, senior engineers right through to new developers, and, trying to understand web performance. And I know specifically in the last little while, at least a solid year and change, we've really been sort of trying to push people to understand RUM a lot more. Is this going to be confusing to the community?
I don't think so. I think actually, like, once you have it in place, it's very clarifying. I mean, to keep riffing on this, like, image directive example, we're talking about, like, what is the value? And, like, with so much of this stuff, it's like, you'll be like, I think this is an improvement, but also, as we were talking about, I think there's a lot of inherent trade-offs. So to use images as an example, I think a lot of people are like, oh, the more breakpoints you have, the better, because, like, don't want to serve extra data to the client. But if that's hurting caching, that might actually be like a net negative. And rather than like going in circles trying to predict how this will perform in the field, if you have the RUM data, it can tell you the answers. And I think something I think is underutilized, or I would like to see people use more of, is like, in particular, like if you're using Web Vitals JS, like you can add debugging data to it, so you can get information on like what element is the LCP element, and like kind of run your own experiments. As we were talking about, and I was going to say, I think if I'm remembering correctly, the stat from the Web Almanac is like on 70% of the page loads, the LCP element was an image, but I might be remembering that wrong. But the point being is you could run that experiment on your own site and like find out the answers.
Nice. And yeah, that was a question that I believe Tanner had asked, something along those lines. I hope, Tanner, that was a good answer. How fast? I'll get to that in a hot minute. Is there anything that we've not sort of touched on? Because I know we've been sort of circling around a main topic. Is there anything that someone wants to bring up before we sort of venture off in another area?
When we were talking about images and what the problem is, I just want to call out the series of articles that Katie wrote on Core Web Vitals a while back, where basically we had all of these like big kind of like problems that keep coming up. Carousels was a big one, both for LCP and for CLS. But Katie wrote a series of like articles about like specific components and problems and solutions. That's really exciting. So I think that I think it's really good to think about things in that way sometimes.
Nice. Something I wanted to ask, and it was a recent article I read, but this is something I've always kind of kept in mind. I've always known that browsers have a significant amount of work to do. Anytime they load up a page, and in fact, I always kind of go back to this one quote from Mr. Atwood, who considered the browser the single greatest software application ever written. And he said it's not even close. And I know we've been talking about, the job of browsers to an extent, and, potentially interventions, especially around like third parties. Does anyone have some sort of feelings about that? And, should browsers be even more aggressive in dealing with the third party situations?
I guess I can take that one. Like, personally, I'm not opposed. And I think like there's a potential, if it's well executed, I think it could move the industry in a good direction. Obviously, there's also the potential to just botch it and, it to not be good for various reasons. And I think with third parties in particular, they have a huge impact. And I think a lot of times, like the people who are handling the third parties, like they aren't on the engineering teams. I mean, so we're talking about how like even engineers have a really hard time understanding performance implications. Like take that and like, magnify it some more, trying to have your marketing team like reason about the IMP implications of, some script you're loading into the tag, like probably isn't realistic, like to see any changes in that in the long term. Whereas like maybe like that's an area where the browser could help out.
Yeah.
And Alex, I think you were going to say something, or was I just seeing things?
No, Annie was. Go ahead, Annie.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is like a super interesting area, but it's really, really hard to measure effectively. I'm very, very excited about some work that Yoav Weiss on my team is doing. It's for like his goal is to measure a single page app. Like how long does that transition take? And to do that, he needs to know like, okay, well, some JavaScript tried to make the transition, but then there's a bunch of async requests that happen, and then eventually all these tasks completed, and then the SPA transition happened. And maybe we could use that code to understand other things like third parties better. So I'm just really excited about the potential to measure it better, because I think it's really, really hard to figure out right now if an intervention is worth it, or like, you know, if there's more we could do in other directions.
I think we can be a little dumber and still get some value in the short run. I mean, I am excited for Yoav's work. I think that's going to be great. If it, although we have seen frameworks attempt to game, you know, metrics as they come down the pike, right? If you think about like what React Fiber is, it's sort of like a late long task generator where it will flush to completion as you interact, which is exactly the wrong time to do it. So what you kind of want instead is something where you build solidarity between folks who make decisions, I think to Katie's point, and the folks who are suffering. And, you know, we have examples of that in browsers doing that. If you think about what the lock icon means, nobody, except for a few cryptographers, really understands what the specific set of cipher suites that a browser will accept means. And yet we tell everyone. We tell everyone whether or not it means, you know, whether or not it means something actionable to them, or whether or not, did you know that the lock icon in your browser is a button and that you can click on it? Almost nobody knows this. And so what can you do with that lock icon? Does it do good things for you? Intense amounts of times are spent, you know, dancing on the head of this particular pin. But what the lock icon really does, to the extent that it's there, is to create solidarity. It causes decision makers to prioritize a particular behavior about their technology choices. And I think there's a role here for browsers to play to help to surface whether or not most users are going to have a good time or a bad time on this site, and to use that as a way to signpost to everyone in the industry whether or not the choices that were made in this particular location were appropriate.
Thank you. I think, Sia, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, kind of going back to this original question about, you know, can browsers do more, especially with third parties? And I do think there's room for more there, but I don't think it takes off the responsibility of an organization or a team to keep an eye on that, because you see this a lot when an organization has not done web performance, and you go in there and you'll see, like, you know, they're using 20 or 30 different third parties, because it's kind of like, it's just like a legacy code base. They just add, and they never see a reason to take off. Or I guess like technical debt, right? It's like they never remove it. So like a browser can do so much, but you're still going to have issues, even if they, you know, do something like Party Town. Like there's still going to be performance impacts when you do need to kind of review those things that you're going, like you still have responsibility as an organization to look at those and remove, especially removing's the best.
Yeah, and I think it even goes like beyond performance. Like I know sometimes I'll be on sites and I'll have the console open and I'm like, why are they pinging Facebook? Like, why are they pinging TikTok? Because it's like this site. I'm like, yo, like you don't need to be like pinging TikTok right now. And like that's like not even like about performance. I feel like it's just about like respecting the user and privacy and all that kind of stuff. So I agree.
Nice. We talked about the, I mean, it was mentioned, and the almanac was mentioned. I know Mr. Viscomi in the chat saying he doesn't believe it's an education problem. For example, he said homeowners don't need training in architecture, and I do not disagree.
So, yeah, but there's an interesting point there, which is to say, you're right. I don't. When I bought my house, I had to pay a lot of people who came and inspected my house and told me it was okay. So, I mean, maybe this is a shout out to all the web performance consultants out there that we need. Maybe this needs to be more of a mandatory thing. I mean, it's interesting to think of this idea that could there really be government regulations enforcing that our websites are fast enough. But I mean, like, that's the interesting thing there, right? Is that
That's how we get cookies banned.
I have no other way to know if my house is built correctly, only because some very expert person told me that.
I know.
But it's also
So
how we get accessibility, right? Accessibility is exactly this. Like, we've gotten to a point where websites are mostly accessible because big companies had a big incentive to sell into the government. In order to be able to do that, they had to be accessible. And so, you know, I take your point about cookie banners. I think we can differentiate good and bad in regulation as well as like good and bad in software. So we go for good regulation.
I was going to say, I love you, Rick, but I don't necessarily agree with this analogy because, like, you're basically saying, like, a homeowner to me is like a web user. A web developer is the person building the house, and that web developer is responsible for, you know, knowing some of these things, or at least knowing how they would get the information or the expertise. You know, so sorry, Rick.
And per Alex, we feel the web developer has been told to use the wrong materials, potentially.
Or the wrong design. Like, if you think about like what is it, like the architecture design drawings and, like, you know, what platform to use. It's like we're promising too much with, I don't know, like asbestos siding. Yeah, it's flame retardant, but you'll die from lung cancer. You know. So.
Yeah, your shed doesn't need an elevator, right? Like, you know, the carport doesn't have to have a swimming pool in it. Like, that's okay. You can be at code and not do those things.
You mean you can build a blog without a front-end JavaScript framework?
Well, and that's it. And, you know, we talk about the literacy. It's not so much always understanding all the metrics and what they do and what they're responsible for, but getting back to what Mel said, sometimes, you know, you have engineers who aren't too sure why they're using particular components. It's just, you know, they've been told that this is what I'm supposed to do. And now they're being asked to sort of have a better justification, or at least a good understanding of what they're doing, why they're using it, and you know, hopefully understanding the outcomes if it doesn't go right. Rob, did you have any questions that you want to highlight?
I think we mostly covered them all. But yeah, that, you know, it just, nope.
Like,
I got lost in some updates. People are still going back and forth about the analogy. I think this is great. Thank you, Rick. Every great analogy just begs to be nitpicked. So thank you for offering that to the group, because I think even chat's getting in on it now.
Yeah.
I do want to say, like I said, engineers, but I do recognize that engineers don't always have that power, right? They have managers, they have their business people pushing for features, and they'll be like, oh, I think we should work on performance, and they'll be shut down. So it's not always the engineers. We know that you're balancing different things.
Absolutely.
And I will say that too, that working with people, you know, we spend a lot about not knowing the complexity in these trade-offs. Sometimes these things are not easy. And I know, especially if you're breaking into the industry, even if you're a mid-level or even a senior developer, sometimes a lot of people prioritize moving in the learning how to do things dimension, because that's what their bosses are saying, right? New features. So I need to keep learning how to do. And I guess find a way, if it can't happen on work, you know, maybe invest a little bit of your time, your free time, if you have any, into trying something where you free yourself of those constraints, because I feel like that was something that I didn't actively search for. It's kind of like wandering in the woods. I just suddenly had an idea for something, and I was like, this time I'm just not gonna create React app to start out with, and just sort of see how far I get into it before I run into it. And you start finding yourself learning all sorts of things you didn't realize you didn't know. And so I will say that with full humility, as someone with over 10 years of experience, it's okay to not know these things. And you can start today, and that's totally fine.
Absolutely. Things are moving extremely fast. You know, today is what, Tuesday? There might be 2 new frameworks by Friday. You know, we could almost certainly guarantee that. But that said, we are actually closing into a full hour here. So what I'd like to do is, in sort of like a closing, have you sort of each and everyone sort of talk about what they're looking forward to in terms of, like, say, the next, we'll say 6 months, and potentially what they feel could be happening in the next year. So I'll start with Annie.
So I'm again really excited about Interaction to Next Paint. It's in the Chrome User Experience Report. You can go check your numbers. You can add it in RUM. It's in some of Google's tooling like Lighthouse already. So definitely check that out. I'm also really excited to get better numbers from single page apps, and also just like how fast a single page app transitions, and also like what else we can do with that JavaScript asynchronous measurement. We're also working on some big improvements to web performance APIs, especially just visibility for RUM, visibility of iframes, and visibility, getting the page unload beacon to really work. So what we did when we one of the analyses we did on IMP was we said, well, how much time is actually spent on the web page after load? And it's about 90% of the time. And a lot of RUM beacons are just excluding that 90% of time on page entirely. So we're really excited about making that easier to monitor and measure in RUM.
Awesome. Developing, or at least improving, the developer experience certainly has to be near the top, if not a P1. So I'm sure the audience thanks you for that. Sia, what you got going on? Oh, actually, I know, but I want to hear it from you.
I mean, wait, do you know more than me? So I'm excited about IMP, even though it's not me, that's Annie. Thanks again, Annie. But yeah, because I feel like it accidentally made people forget about JavaScript in the Core Web Vitals for a while, and we all know that JavaScript is still a big issue in performance. So exciting to see something come back. For me personally, as I mean, I am still new to Shopify, so like learning the whole environment, learning the platform as well, because I'm trying to make a few changes on the platform side. But of course, you got to ramp up and learn the code base, and it's a lot on a new platform. So I'm excited about that. And of course, helping our merchants and making e-commerce better for everyone. But yeah.
Awesome. I mean, everyone wants to purchase something. And again, shout outs to Sia and her team. I guess the merchant web performance team, is that what?
So my second week, we got reorganized, and I'm still trying to figure out the new team name. So that's why I just say it's Merchant Web Performance.
Awesome. I'll get into a little comment about that a little later. Alex, how about yourself, outside of being in Vancouver?
Well, I'm super excited about IMP, and in part because it's going to help us, I think, move down this direction of session depth, amortized metrics, right? Like, we're all kind of implicitly making a trade-off in our heads about like, well, this kind of site can afford to do this much up front because it'll pay off later. And the blindness that we've got collectively about whether or not it does pay off is a big impediment to changing our discussion around architectures. So I think IMP is going to help make space for more HTML first or more HTML centric architectures to help kill off some of the JavaScript bloat that has really plagued many of the teams that I work with. So that is extremely exciting to me.
That's awesome. And, anything that's going to be HTML first has to be heralded for sure. And like you said, JavaScript has been a thorn in people's side for quite a while now. And, sometimes it seems like there's no real end to it. But we shall move on. Mel, how about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm mostly excited. I'm writing the performance chapter for Web Almanac this year, so along with the help of Sia and Rick, actually. So I'm excited for that. And then I'm mostly just excited to get more people interested in web performance and kind of bridge that literacy gap. That's something that I'm really passionate about. So.
Amazing. And shout outs to the good people, all I'm sure 100 and change who are working diligently to get the Web Almanac finished. I think they're looking at a launch date of like end of September or something like that. No spoilers, but we're all looking forward to it. And Katie.
Personally, just excited to learn more about frameworks. I've been in the performance space for a while, but never interacted that closely with frameworks. Like, in panels like this, when questions come up, I'm just like, yeah, lots of JavaScript. So like really understanding on a deeper level, like what's going on there. And then I don't know, maybe more concretely, like I think the concept of font fallbacks, like being able to swap them in a way that doesn't have layout shift the idea has been floating around for a while, but there really hasn't been any movement on like concrete ways to like make this practical at scale, and I'm thinking maybe we'll see some movement on that in the future, which I'm excited about. Yeah.
That's awesome. And, I'm very excited to hear more about some of your work because, again, the Aurora project, when I was first introduced to it or it was mentioned, I was like, hey, what's going on here? And as Sia mentioned, working at Shopify to sort of affect some change at scale, to an extent, I think Aurora is doing some of the same, having worked with Next, working with Next, Nuxt, I believe. And then you mentioned Angular as well. So I think that's going to be super duper interesting. I know no one asked me, but I'm actually excited to see, I know Annie next month, the month after that over at Perf Now, and I know a lot of people, Alex, are you going to be going? Because I feel like that would be something I could see you at.
I'm sorry, to which?
Perf Now in Amsterdam, Performance
Oh,
Now.
yes. That's currently on the plan, so I'm excited.
Amazing. All right. Well, that's a few of us who are going to be there. But if anyone's wondering, Performance Now is a web performance conference that's back in person this year, and quite a few people seem to be going. So it's going to be an exciting time, I think, for a lot of great minds to come together and discuss potential solutions in the future. Rob, I mean, we didn't ask you, but what are you looking forward to?
I just look forward to having conversations like this. I will say that performance, a little bit like accessibility in my experience, is a virtuous cycle. Get somebody on your team or become the person on your team that's nerded out about it and watch as everybody starts getting into it. It really sort of just takes one person. And if you can change the conversation from something adversarial, something we're doing wrong, to a competition, people trying to find the coolest new trick that's making things better, it can really transform a team's whole attitude about it. So I would say if your team isn't already excited about performance, maybe become that person or look for that person and then follow them in what they do, because that's worked on teams I've been on before. And like I said, it can get very addictive once you start to see the returns.
Yeah, absolutely. And getting back to what Mel said, I think literacy is going to be important. Now, we're not asking you to write a PhD on performance afterwards, but it's really just to have an understanding of how things work. And again, what you'd mentioned in terms of the engineers sort of owning it, being responsible for what they're using and understanding what the outcomes are going to be like when they do. Because, what's good for, site X may not be for site Z or Z, I don't know. And thereafter. So the literacy part is going to be, somewhat important. And again, it's not about, knowing everything, but knowing or understanding how it works. Rob, so should we just kind of close this off right now?
Yeah. So we'll close by saying thank you, everybody, for attending this State of Web Performance. We do have these a couple times a year. So if you were excited by this conversation, we'll certainly have it again in the future. So make sure you save your questions or bring them to Twitter and reach out to our wonderful panelists and continue the conversation online. I know they love holding these conversations. So if you had some questions that you meant to ask and didn't get answers for, or something comes up later, or as I said in the chat, if you just want to continue the analogy discussion, please meet us all on Twitter and we'll pick things up from there. So thank you again, everybody, for attending today, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you, folks. Have yourself a great day.